penetrate enemy lines in the Sikorsky YR-4 to rescue an American pilot downed in the Burmese jungle. Uncover hidden Nazi secrets that stunned American helicopter designers after World War II. Then storm the post-war marketplace with commuter copters and find out why they didn't take off in suburbia. Vertical flight moves away from the battlefront and back to the home front.
Germany in the late 1930s. World War II had not yet begun, but already, in the vertical flight race, the German Reich was ahead. The Focke-Achgelis FW-61 held every world helicopter record. The test pilot, Hanne Reich, had shown the FW-61 to the German public. The rest of the world also watched. But when war broke out in 1939, information stopped. For American helicopter pioneers, there was only silence from Germany.
The first really successful flights were made around 1937 by Focke in Germany. They were followed by other flights. However, during the recent years, we had no news from Germany, and we do not know of any further success of these outstanding pioneer designs.
But behind the silence, there had been further development, a great deal of it. One of the most successful German designers was Anton Flettner. In 1942, the Flettner Kolibri became the world's first military helicopter. Only 22 were built for operation with the German Navy. They were used for reconnaissance, flying from platforms above the gun turrets of convoy escort ships. They had a reputation as hardy, reliable, and practical machines. The Focke-Achgelis 223 Drache, or Dragon, used the same side-by-side layout as the record-breaking FA-61. It made its first flight in August 1940. It was much larger than the FA-61 and was capable of lifting 2,000 pounds. It had the amazing maximum speed for that time of 115 miles an hour. Some had a machine gun fitted for self-defense. It was used by the Luftwaffe for transport, supply, and reconnaissance. At the other end of the size spectrum was the unpowered Focke-Achgelis Fa-330. It was a one-man automotive kite designed for towing behind U-boats for observation. A telephone line was embedded in the 500-foot towing cable for communication between pilot and U-boat. The Doppelhoff WN-342 was another small observation helicopter, the first to be powered by jets on the rotor blade tips. 4 prototypes were built, but it never entered production. Because of high fuel consumption in the tip jets, later versions only used them for takeoff and landing, and it flew as an autogyro in level flight. When the Allies entered Germany at the end of the war, they found among other helicopters 3 Flettner Kolibris in perfect working order. One went to Russia, and the other 2 were taken back to the United States, where they went through a comprehensive test and evaluation program. This rare post-war American film shows the excellent stability and control characteristics that surprised American helicopter designers. In the war years, the American helicopter industry had itself come of age. This is the Sikorsky XR-4. On May 6, 1943, it landed safely in a cleared space on the cargo deck of the tanker Bunker Hill. It was America's first helicopter shipboard landing. The XR-4 was not the military's first choice to launch the U.S. Army into the helicopter age. It had been rejected in favor of a helicopter rather like the German FA-61 in basic layout. The Platt LePage had side-by-side rotors and a fuselage like an airplane. But Igor Sikorsky was not a man to take rejection lying down.
Sikorsky aircraft, which lost a design competition on paper, decided that now was the time to go ahead full steam with the concept of the helicopter. So largely with private financing, with the support of then United Aircraft, today it's United Technologies, the decision was made to build the helicopter independent of government orders.
The Platt-Lepage's similarity to the German FW-61 was not accidental. In the 1930s, W. Lawrence Lepage had visited Germany and been impressed by the German approach to rotorcraft design. The XR-1 made its first flight in May 1941. It was found to have a weak airframe, which slowed down the testing process. But in any case, it was never to become a satisfactory operational machine. The Army's original decision to choose the XR-1 had been based on caution.
And they proposed the same low-risk solution that had already been demonstrated in Germany, that is by Professor Focke, the two rotors side by side. As a backup, that was the XR-1. And then the XR-2 and the XR-3 were autogyros, low-risk fallback decisions. And then as the VS-300 began to prove itself, and began to demonstrate very desirable flying characteristics, a last contract for the XR-4 was let to Sikorsky aircraft. Basically, at first, it was a contract to build a much larger two-seater version of the VS-300 machine. And that eventually evolved, however, into the XR-4.
The XR-4's delivery flight from Stratford, Connecticut to Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio, established an American helicopter distance record. When it was officially handed over to the Army on May 18, 1942, it was ready to go into service. Present at the handing over ceremony was one of America's greatest aviation pioneers, Orville Wright. In April 1944, a Sikorsky YR-4 rescued an American pilot and 3 British casualties from behind enemy lines in the Burmese jungle. They had to be taken out one at a time. It was one of the Sikorsky R-4's most remarkable actions of the war, and a pointer to the helicopter's future as an effective military tool. Even before World War II was over, people were thinking about the new life peacetime would bring. The idea of the family helicopter seemed a possibility. The man tipping the car park attendant in this promotional film is Sikorsky test pilot Les Morris, and the helicopter is the Sikorsky test bed, the VS-300. Boundless possibilities for future use of the helicopter were in Igor Sikorsky's mind almost before it was off the drawing board.
We can visualize the helicopter being used for carrying mail, passengers, freight. We can further expect its extensive use for all kinds of emergencies, such as forest control, health, or medical assistance. And finally, we can expect its development for private use. One could hazard the hypothesis that our ways of life would be changed just as they were when the automobile came into general use.
But the idea of rotorcraft for the average family was not new. In the mid-1930s, the Pitcairn Company had suggested the possibility that there could be an autogyro in every garage, even if the rotors might not quite fit through the garage door. Any autogyro could land, but only the Pitcairn AC-35 could land, have its rotors folded, and then drive away on a public road, just like an automobile. This wasn't a fantasy. the AC-35 was actually approved for road use. But the helicopter designers took the 1930s possibilities one step further. Frank Piasecki, in his first helicopter, the PV-2, promoted his product with the idea that you could land at the gas station and fill up if your tank was getting low. And if that didn't stretch your imagination, think of the reaction of other golfers when you casually landed on a golf course and left your brand new helicopter next to a green while you went off to shoot 18 holes. But when the war came to an end, it wasn't all sweetness and light in the helicopter industry.
You see, this was after the war, so there was just no military deep interest, no military programs, where the nation was in a closed-down mode.
In the absence of orders from the military, Charles Command went out of his way to interest the general public in the helicopter. He staged regular demonstrations outside his factory, showing off the helicopter's bag of tricks to a willing audience.
We were going to build a helicopter for commercial use for every man to fly because it would be that easy. And we had the vision that the sky would be black with them. Kids are entitled to dream. That moves the world. And we were kids dreaming.
If the kids were dreaming, so were the business executives. But there was more chance of the helicopter being adopted by corporate leaders than the average suburban household. Nevertheless, the American public was more than happy to watch the spectacular barnstorming publicity events staged all over the country by the energetic helicopter manufacturers. Indoor flights and 4th of July exhibitions attracted thousands of willing spectators who embraced this new phenomenon as a symbol of American ingenuity. Ingenuity that would take them into a new life after the trials of wartime were forgotten. The Bell Company staged these events, and Sikorsky did the same. And even the very small manufacturers tried to join the drive to capture the imagination of the ordinary American. Stanley Hiller Jr. was just 17 in 1942 when he started to build his first helicopter. By the time he was 19, it was finished, and he flew it for the first time in the University of California Stadium on May 14, 1944. Hiller's coaxial rotor system was extremely effective, giving stability and simplicity of operation. Hiller believed strongly in the idea of a helicopter in every garage and developed a number of other models, including one called the Commuter. Hiller also produced a conventional single-rotor helicopter using his rotormatic system for rotor stability. It also used an overhead lever control instead of the usual cyclic stick between the pilot's knees. This helicopter was to go into production as the immensely successful Hiller Model 360. At a time when families were looking to escape the city centers and settle in the space and peace of the countryside, the helicopter seemed to be the ideal daily commuter vehicle. The Kellett XR-8 was produced by the Kellett Autogyro Company. It was America's first helicopter to use the side-by-side intermeshing rotor system. But the dream of personal helicopter transport was never to become fact. Dr. Bob Rosen of NASA.
Kind of picture we all heard about from popular mechanics in the 40s and early 50s of everybody having one of these things in their garage and commuting to work is something that's not going to happen. And when I think of the difficulty of traffic patterns now and think about everybody commuting in a rotorcraft to work, I'll tell you, if there's one, I'm not going to be doing that no matter what else happens with all those people in the sky.
But if the everyman helicopter was just a fantasy, There were more than enough real commercial applications just waiting to be recognized. In post-war America, helicopter manufacturers were confronted by stark economic reality.
The regulations to get a type certificate so that we could sell them had been severely increased, so that we needed a lot of money. So began there the first of a series of endless compromises. The first was we'd better give up the idea of every man's helicopter and build a crop duster.
Back in the 30s, the autogyro had been recognized as a useful machine for crop dusting. But while the autogyro's rotors helped distribute sprays more thoroughly than ground equipment could, the helicopter went one better. Its positive downwash forced sprays around and under the plants in a way never before possible. It was a spectacular sight for any onlookers, and in those days, nobody worried about the health risks. Helicopters had other advantages over the established forms of crop spraying. Ground machinery was slow, could damage the crops, and could only work when ground conditions allowed. Fixed-wing aircraft were fast, but that was half their problem. Speed made them dangerous in confined spaces. The helicopter's ability to control its speed in the air from 0 to somewhere approaching 100 miles an hour gave it a flexibility no other vehicle had. Helicopters were also highly maneuverable and were able to adjust to the details of the ground surface for the greatest effect. The military was no longer the sole target of helicopter manufacturers. They recognized a huge civilian market potential. The task was to identify a need and then sell the helicopter as an answer. On March 8, 1946, this Bell 47 received the first American type certificate for a commercial helicopter. Newspapers, which had used autogyros since the 30s, were quick to see the helicopter as a faster way of getting reporters and photographers out to a story and back again. Helicopters could land on a roof or in a car park. Film could be processed quickly, and the photographs could be on the streets in the evening edition, while surface-bound reporters were still fighting traffic jams. The helicopter found a role in animal conservation. In rugged, inaccessible territory, it could monitor species numbers, or if necessary, herd the animals to a new location. Within a year of coming into service, the Bell 47 was being used in the oil fields in Louisiana. Its value for geophysical surveys and for transporting personnel to difficult locations was immediately recognized, and soon helicopters were a common sight in oil fields all around the world. But the helicopter really came into its own on offshore oil rigs. In 1948, a Bell 47 made the first helicopter landing on a rig 19 miles out to sea in the Gulf of Mexico. Soon, helicopter manufacture became an international industry. In December 1946, the British Westlands Company acquired the rights to produce and sell Sikorsky helicopters throughout the world except the North American continent. Westlands was free to develop and improve the basic Sikorsky models, and their version of the S-51, the Dragonfly, went into service in October 1948. It had a larger engine, higher speed, and longer range than the Sikorsky original. It earned a reputation as an extremely effective rescue helicopter. By the 1950s, the Westlands Company had established a strong identity of its own, in spite of the unmistakable Sikorsky lines of its product. While Westlands followed the Sikorsky approach, the British Ferry Company was moving in its own direction. The Jet Gyrodyne was a convertiplane with tip jets and a pusher propeller. In December 1948, the British Sierva Company, famous for its autogyros, released the world's only three-rotor helicopter. It was called the Sierva Air Horse, but its suitability for large-scale crop dusting earned it the name Spraying Mantis. At the time, it was the largest helicopter in the world. The rotors all revolved in the same direction, but torque was canceled out by their triangular arrangement. British military Westlands Dragonflies served with the Royal Air Force in the Malayan jungles in the early 1950s. They were formed into the first British Casualty Evacuation Unit. At about the same time, American helicopters began to perform the same service in Korea. Helicopter revolution was just beginning on the field of battle.
The helicopter is an amazing machine, able to fly forward, backward, sideways, and to hover. These unique flight characteristics have enabled the helicopter to perform a multitude of military and civilian missions.
The helicopter was developed from the autogyro, which Sierva invented in 1920s. And in those days, the autogyro was just a fixed-wing airplane with one of the wings removed and a rotor attached to it. The cockpit controls were the same as what the airplane had originally, just a control stick, rudder pedals, and a throttle. And the first rotor controls were what they call direct controls, because you moved the rotor axis directly. When you pushed the stick forward, the rotor leaned forward. When you pushed it to the left, the rotor leaned to the left. When you pushed it to the right, it leaned to the right. And you got the same control effect you would have got from the airplane. I learned to fly autogyros on a rather strange aircraft. This was an aircraft that flew similar to an autogyro. The rotor was not powered in flight. And the first autogyro that I flew was a side-by-side machine that weighed 2,400 pounds and had a 210-horse engine. It was similar to the one that Admiral Byrd took to the South Pole, and they were built here in Philadelphia by Kellett. When the helicopter came along, it added a lot of other things. They added a collective pitch system, which meant you could add pitch to the rotor and lift the machine straight up.
In May 1940, Igor Sikorsky flew the first successful helicopter in the United States. Controlling the craft in flight was Igor's first priority. Captain H. Franklin Gregory, a seasoned autogyro pilot and project officer for the newly formed Army Air Corps helicopter project, was given the opportunity to fly the VS-300 in July 1940. Later, he wrote,
"More than anything else, the VS-300 reminded me of a bucking bronco. She was ornery. When I wanted her to go down, she went up. When I tried to back her up, she persisted on going forward. About the only thing she was agreeable to was getting down again, and that probably was because she wanted to get fed and pampered by the mechanics and her maker.
Later, after receiving some pointers from Igor, Captain Gregory successfully flew the craft and made a perfect landing. A government contract soon followed.
The biggest challenge for the helicopter in the early days from controls was that we had no idea at that time of how to design a helicopter with adequate control. So with Miss Sikorsky and a few of us, we had a very large engineering department. We had 6 people. And we designed the VS-300. Matter of fact, VS-300 was designed with only 2 people on the project and some inputs from others. And we had to go to booms, lateral booms with propellers on the end of the booms at control rotors. But Mr. Sikorsky said, no, we got to eliminate all that somehow. So we went to take the 2 rotors, which he was against because they flew well, but it allowed them to start flying. So he put one of those rotors way up on top on a pylon, and the other rotor is the anti-torque rotor for governing torque, which you have to take care of in a single rotor machine. And with that, we flew even better by putting a cyclic control, which we developed as a natural evolution. We developed so that we could laterally control the helicopter. Very shortly after that, with the one cyclic control feature of lateral control being handled by cyclic, we developed on the main rotor a full cyclic control, and that was a swash plate with push rods coming down from it, and with that swash plate attached to the rotor blades, 2 rotor blades on the first machine, we're able to control 360 degrees the cyclic movement of the helicopter. We built the XR4 very quickly. It took about 7 months, flew it, and at that time, we developed the cyclic control for it, for the XR4, the same as for the BS-300. In that regard, we got a machine that was not only acceptable, but the Army thought would be an acceptable solution, control solution for any production helicopter of that size. We went to Washington to the commander, to the chief of staff, and he gave us contracts for 28, 35, and 50, and the single rotor helicopter was born.
The flight of the PV-2, which had the overhead control stick, that is, a control stick came down, was very natural. It wasn't anything difficult. The throttle was our means of lift control. And to do that more accurately, we put a long lever arm on the throttle so we could have fairly large motion to control the throttle. So we adjusted vertical lift with the throttle, which had therefore a little lag, and our lateral and longitudinal control was with the cyclic overhead stick, and the rudder pedals operated the tail rotor. We were all set to demonstrate this to a lot of people from Navy and Army and Air Force, and I was about ready to take off when a man came up to me and he said, do you have a pilot's license? And I said, well, no, but I have a student pilot's license. And he said, well, you can't fly into Washington National Airport unless you have a pilot's license. I said, okay, how do I get it? He said, well, we arranged for that, and we brought over a man, Paul Young, from FAA across the river, and Paul Young said, okay, what does a helicopter do? And I said, well, you can fly in a square with turning at each corner. He said, okay, do it. I did. Came back to the original point. And he says, what else can it do? I said, well, you can fly the same square, but always keeping a constant heading. He said, okay, do it. And I did that, came back. He said, okay, you got a license. And that was the first private pilot helicopter license received prior to having a pilot's license in an airplane. I'd solo in an airplane, but I didn't have a license in one. Therefore, I became the first helicopter pilot, licensed pilot in the U.S.
The most interesting part of those early days was the cockpit configuration and the control system. And in that regard, I think we at Bell were very fortunate that the original designers, Arthur Young and Bart Kelly, didn't have any aviation background. They were not airplane pilots or aircraft design engineers. So their mind was open, completely open to explore whatever type of control system would best suit the helicopter environment. Recognizing that in forward flight, your helicopter flies very much like a fixed wing. So in forward flight, your fixed wing controls could apply to a helicopter very easily. But then when you get into the hovering mode and flying backwards and sideways, they felt we ought to investigate other control systems. But the one system that we liked very much and is still on the aircraft, ship number 3 that's in the Smithsonian, is the one that has a conventional cyclic coming up from the floor, but instead of a collective pitch handle pivoting at a point to the rear and lifting up and pushing down, we had a tiller arrangement. There was a pylon that came up from the floor on your left, and mounted on that pylon was a handle coming back from the pylon, and the handle can be moved in a vertical plane, and that gave you your collective. And for your directional control, you merely turned it as you would a tiller on a sailboat or a tiller on the early electric cars prior to using steering wheels on automobiles. And the throttle control there was mounted on top of the cyclic in a manner similar to your throttle control on a motorcycle. And that worked out very well. Then when we decided to go to a collective pitch control mounted close to the floor, we of course naturally put the throttle control on the end of the collective pitch, because it was quite natural that as you lifted up on pitch and increased the load requirement or the power requirements of the engine, that you could very easily, as you lifted up, your wrist would just naturally twist the grip in the direction required to apply more power to keep your engine RPM constant.
The 1930s and 40s marked an era of experimentation, both in terms of rotary-wing technology and in the operation of helicopters. Helicopters were proving themselves useful in both military and civilian applications, such as search and rescue. On June 25, 1950, North Korean troops stormed the 38th parallel into South Korea, launching the Korean War. Helicopters played a critical role in Korea and once and for all proved their military value. In less than 2 decades, helicopter cockpits had evolved from the VS-300 open-frame perch to fully enclosed control stations for multiple crew members.
The implementation of cockpit displays, as I see it, started back in the mid-50s, where VFR flight was still the most prominent
way of flying a helicopter. Visibility was one of the highest premiums that we had because your helicopter flight regime is low altitude, all weather conditions, special VFR, as long as you can see the ground. We felt the instrument panel back in those days, as narrow as it was, and with as few instruments as it was still obstructing forward visibility. So we went ahead and moved the pilot forward and placed him in the center of the aircraft with the conventional helicopter controls of its day, which is your rudder pedals and your cyclic coming up from the floor and your collective pitch to one side. But we moved the instrument panel off to the left. And we angled the instrument panel so that there was no parallax. It felt as if you were sitting on a magic carpet, literally, protected from the from your relative wind by your bubble. And that was a very, very successful cockpit, we felt.
The war was the catalyst for innovation in both the production and operation of the helicopter. The introduction of the turbine engine in helicopters by command allowed for increased payloads, higher speeds, and extended ranges, while reducing vibration. This provided a more comfortable cockpit for the pilot. The discovery of the transistor in 1948 started an electronics revolution. By the mid-1950s, aviation electronics, or avionics, were coming of age. Heavy mechanical and electromechanical systems were being replaced by lightweight and reliable avionics. Cockpits became populated with a new breed of instruments, enabling pilots to aviate, navigate, and communicate better. The promise of new sensors and displays challenged cockpit designers to dream up new ways to make helicopters more flexible than ever before. Helicopter manufacturers aggressively researched ways to enable helicopter pilots who were used to flying under visual flight rules, or VFR, to adapt to instrument flight rules, or IFR. Under IFR, the pilot relies solely on instruments to fly his aircraft.
What we needed to do was to provide the pilot with a view of the outside world similar to what it was under VFR condition, using the cues of the VFR condition that were good and sufficient. Well, one of the major challenges was to try to recreate a VFR environment because the helicopter had inherited its instrumentation from fixed wing. Therefore, it was not able to be any more flexible on instruments than the fixed wing. And yet, the vehicle itself is so flexible, can hover, go backwards, sideways. The second challenge for the designer was to put together a team of researchers who both understood the pilot side, so we had to have pilots, and also understood the scientific approach side. First of all, on on simulation, we were able to make a synthetic display. Then we wanted to put these on the windscreen where the pilot was used to finding them. And there were two ways of doing this. One, you could build a large screen and project it on that. Two, and this was very new at the time, was to put either a helmet-mounted or head-mounted display where the image could be projected onto a very small screen, but as the pilot looked at it, it was a large screen image. Another one of the technologies that was coming on that would give us a pictorial image was the forward-looking infrared, or the FLIR. And that could look through most atmospheric conditions and give the pilot a picture. Something unique that was developed here at Bell was the rotor blade radar. And this radar, different than any radar I have ever seen, was a high-resolution radar. It could provide a 360-degree field of view all the way around the helicopter. The resolution was such that you could pick out forced landing fields in any terrain. You could, for example, see a bush or a human walking across a field. And there were ways of tying this in with an altimeter so that as you approached the ground or as you raised off the ground, the image would get smaller or bigger, like the real world does. The problem is defining what the outside world provides in visual cues that are necessary, and then providing these in a way that are logical and in the right position. So those are the technologies that came along that helped us in our look for the IFR helicopter cockpit of the future.
Came to Bell in 1955 as the human engineering director, I guess you'd say, in the Army Navy Instrumentation Program, which was being sponsored by the Office of Naval Research. Well, this was the brainchild of Commander George Hoover of the Office of Naval Research, who was a pilot, and he felt that it was certainly the kinds of instruments which were in the cockpit at that time could certainly be improved upon. Those instruments were too difficult to interpret. So his notion was that what we need to do is to encode the information in the cockpit that you need for instrument flight, to make those instruments and that information as analogous to that information that you see in the real world as possible. The unique feature was that we take the information from the contact world, analyze what the pilot uses when he flies contact, and encode that information in the cockpit as nearly as analogous to the contact world as you can possibly make it when he's flying instruments. And that's why it was the contact analog. And George Hoover was a very, very zealous proponent of this concept. So the problem was one of how do we incorporate the contact cues into the cockpit and supplement it with the qualitative information the pilot needs, and do this in a fashion that is least confusing and allows him to operate his machine effectively and reduce the training time, and particularly in times of pressures of both of time and outside exigencies, that he doesn't get confused, that he can interpret it correctly. But we just didn't have enough information capacity in our computers to do the things that needed to be done. We couldn't generate a nice analog display of the real world. Now you can it's common to generate an analog display. So all of those developments, I think our program at that time actually stimulated a good deal of research in that generation field too. And so today you do have the capacity to do that. I'm not familiar enough with the present day cockpit to know how much is incorporated these days into it, but the capacity, the capability is there. And I would hope that some of the concepts are there.
In the early 60s, Bell Helicopter, through the ANIP program that was funded by the Office of Naval Research, built, as far as we know, the first 6 degree of freedom flight simulator in the world. 6 degrees meaning pitch, roll, and yaw, as well as fore and aft, sidewards, and vertical, so that these motions represented all of the motions that the pilot would sense. With this simulator, we were able, with the concept of the contact analog, to put in to the cockpit people who were not IFR qualified, sometimes people who were not even pilots, and they were able to fly instruments, if you could call it that, because they were flying by instruments. So that was a successful program.
Well, cockpit standardization began with the fixed-wing aircraft. During World War II, the data shows that there were a series of very serious accidents in which pilots would grasp the wrong control, usually mixing up the flap and landing gear handles. And so the Air Force initiated these efforts in the 50s primarily, and tried to establish where primary flight controls would be located in the cockpit so that people who were trained in multiple aircraft could switch cockpits and not induce accidents. This also then began an expansion in which the Air Force brought in the other services who also had aircraft, and we in the DoD tried to, and indeed did, standardize through the development of MIL specifications the location of controls, vision envelopes outside of the cockpit so that we could minimize collisions and maximize vision. We also talked about instrumentation itself and the location on the panel, the design of instruments. All of these were designed for ease of reading and ease of location. It even went beyond that eventually, that when the NATO forces were formed after World War II, we sat down with our NATO allies, and the objective here was to ensure that Allied pilots could fly one another's aircraft. So we standardized cockpits in that vein through the same methodology, and they were usually a little more difficult to do. The language and cultural differences between the various allies caused a lot of strain. Sometimes we would spend hours debating the definition of a caution label in a cockpit because it meant something different in French than it did in English. Very challenging times.
Unlike airplane pilots, who fly from the left seat, helicopter pilots command from the right seat. The reason for this unique helicopter cockpit standard is well established, but often misunderstood.
Well, I guess I'd really like to know the answer to that question myself. Perhaps the real documented reason is maybe lost in its obscurity. Because my helicopter two-station design experience has only been in the last 5 or 10 years, and because all of my past experience before that was in a fixed-wing world, I've often wondered why those helicopter pilots sit on the right side.
Why do helicopter pilots sit on the right? Well, I happen to know the absolute truth on this subject. In fact, I know 4 or 5 of the absolute truths.
And one of the first excuses given was so the pilot could keep track of the emergency hoist if he was picking somebody up. But actually, it was resolved to the fact that the pilot uses his left hand less than he does his right hand because he just uses collective pitch to lift him off the ground, and then he doesn't have much to do with that as he's flying, and he doesn't have to trim the engine. So the left hand is free to flip switches like turning radios on and off or investigating things with the switches that it provided. And that's why he sits on the right.
And that was as a result of the first helicopter development and the first helicopters being designed and built. We wanted the collective stick, which is the power lever, to be on the pilot's left and to have the eccentric control, which controls the direction and movement of the helicopter, to be on the pilot's right hand.
One, helicopters started out as a single-piloted aircraft with a single seat in the front. Thus, all helo pilots, or for that matter at the time, both helo pilots, learned to fly with the left hand on the collective and the right hand on the cyclic. Thus, when the 2 seats came along, the co-pilot went to the left.
I think I'm responsible for that. Captain Davis of the Patuxent Naval Flight Test Center wanted to make a decision as to which side the pilot would sit. Well, I went through the Coast Guard school there and for test purposes, and I flew very fine on the right seat with the left hand, but when it came to the left seat, I honestly couldn't fly that machine with the left hand on the cyclic and the right hand on collective. It seems silly, but there it is. So when we talked about this at Captain Davis's office, I proposed that the pilot can lock his collective pitch lever and use his left hand for radios, maps, cigarettes, or whatever, that he wants to do and still fly the aircraft with the right hand. And that meant he had to sit on the right side.
The second truth is that actually this was done in the early days of helicopters with unreliable low-powered engines. And this was done so that the co-pilot could signal left-hand turns and right-hand turns to following automobile traffic while the aircraft was being towed back to the base or perhaps taxiing on a high-density altitude day.
The answer is quite obvious. You're going to fly from the right side in order to have your left hand, your free hand, available to easily move to the control panel.
The third reason, and I get this from Jack King, the venerable command tech rep, and what he told me was that Al Ashley knows the real answer, but nobody's ever bothered to ask him.
The key reason I recall from the early days is that the collective was accessible to both pilots.
The fourth answer is it seemed like a good idea at the time.
Well, there are a lot of stories, and the explanation I got came from Igor Sikorsky himself, who said when he designed the helicopter, he designed it for operation with the right hand used for the cyclic control and the left hand used for the collective. When he added a second seat in order to teach someone else how to fly a helicopter, for both economic purposes and other reasons, they just added one more cyclic but maintained a common collective between the two of them. When this new instructor pilot went out into the world to teach the rest of the world, he said, I want you people to learn to fly like Igor flew it, so I'm going to maintain my seat on the left, and you sit on the right and learn to be a pilot. And this is why the pilots sit on the right and the co-pilot sits on the left.
The fifth answer is that it is said that Christ sits at the right hand of God, and therefore this seemed like an appropriate place for a pilot's ego.
The military potential of helicopters that had become apparent in Korea was proven out in Vietnam. Troop transports carried men and equipment into virtually inaccessible areas. Helicopter gunships engaged in close air support. Huge flying cranes hoisted downed aircraft out of the jungle. Medevac helicopters whisked wounded soldiers from the battlefield. There is no denying that Vietnam was the helicopter war.
When the war came along, things began to change. They had to fly at nighttime, a new requirement, so lighting had to change in the cockpit. They got caught in weather sometimes, so the instruments had to be upgraded to allow them to fly whenever they would get into inadvertent meteorological conditions. The role of flying aft of the earth meant that you had to fly down in and among the trees, not above them and over them anymore. So navigation became an important issue. So there was and in the same environment, crashworthiness took on new ramifications because aircraft were close to the ground and they made contact with the ground much easier than before. So there was a whole series of things that changed in the cockpit because of military requirements.
Night vision goggles are electro-optical binoculars which amplify the ambient illumination up to a point where the human eye can see it. It's actually a magnifier of light. Well, I think it was in the early 1960s that someone said, Army aviation is not a fly-by-night outfit, but with a little luck it could be. Night vision goggles are the luck that allows the military to operate at night under conditions where the normal human eye can't see. I think the biggest impact that night vision goggles has had on crew station design is that it has forced crew station designers to look again at how we see and perceive things. Basically, it has been represented by a change in the color of cockpit lighting from the conventional white or red lighting to what we call NVG green. Right now, the green-lighted cockpits are as common as the red-lighted cockpits were in World War II. And to get everything to be green in the cockpit and still as readable as it has always been has been a challenge. By the late 1960s, electronic technology had proven itself reliable and tolerant to helicopter operating environments. Even the most flight-critical helicopter systems were being replaced or supplemented with electronics.
A fly-by-wire flight control system, in the simplest sense, merely replaces the mechanical links that are moving toward the control surfaces of the aircraft, replaces them with wires and computers. The pilot no longer is the hard-working helicopter pilot that we know today, fighting the helicopter's unforgiving dynamics. What the pilot becomes is merely another driver. And almost anybody can do that driving function. But the new role of the pilot is now to focus more on the mission and the functions of the mission rather than flying the aircraft. Flying the aircraft can become an extremely simple task, and the performance one obtains with the fly-by-wire system is precision of the type we never saw before. It has been a more difficult challenge in the helicopter because the helicopter has a very difficult single-point failure in its main rotor. A single-point failure problem has been eliminated in the fixed-wing world because if we have a critical surface, we can split this critical surface into multiple parts. So if one part fails, the surface is still controllable and the aircraft is controllable with remaining surfaces. In the helicopter, the main rotor is a single-point catastrophic failure area, and one requires very special care and very special levels of redundancy in order to keep that control survivable. That has been the most difficult part.
In the late 70s, with the advent of what we call electronic displays, these became known for cockpit purposes as CRTs or multifunction displays. The information that was previously being displayed on separate instruments could now be put onto one instrument and in symbolic or graphical form to give the pilot a better rendition of what he needed to fly by from his instrument panel than what he had previously had on the non-integrated cockpits or on the electromechanical indicators. The OH-58 cockpit was the first helicopter glass cockpit that was put into production. Being a reconnaissance aircraft, outside visibility was a very important part of that mission. In other words, we couldn't go keep filling up the instrument panel with more and more displays and things and take away outside visibility because the crew had to have it to fly close to the ground and close to obstacles. That we did some studies that showed when you're flying that kind of a mission that the pilot needs to be outside the cockpit about 95% of the time. So this means only 5% of his time is available to come into the cockpit and look for information. In a non-integrated cockpit, that was completely unacceptable. He could not find the information and process it and act upon it in that 5% of the time. Sometimes this meant only a second or two. With the integrated cockpit, glass cockpit, and with the proper kind of information display and processing, that information could be presented to the pilot in a format that was readily available to him when he needed it, and he knew exactly where to go for it and minimized his time in the cockpit.
In my opinion, the most important non-technical consideration in the development of an effective operator interface is the actual enlistment of the operator himself. If we can get the operators to invest themselves in the design and development process, then when the time comes to expose the design to the total community, you have on your side a number of credible allies. Fully integrated cockpits are very much different than what we're used to dealing with. A fully integrated cockpit changes the entire nature of the mission and, in fact, may impact tactics and employment. Operators come into the design process with the intent, usually, of correcting problems that they've had on systems in the past. What must be done is to overcome these initial prejudices and get them to participate in the development of the new design. Once they do that, they can rapidly become your most effective tool in the development of a new design. The second most important thing to do in new systems is for the man-machine interface designer to become the custodian of the overall system view. Every engineer, every operator will come forward with a new feature that must be incorporated into the system. If these aren't controlled, the system completely becomes unmanageable. If examined independently, each feature probably has positive contributions. However, each one brings with it workload, each one brings with it cognitive workload, physical workload, and memorization requirements. The man-machine interface designer must become the zookeeper and handle all of these feature creatures, put them in their place. If it's not done, possibility exists that the system will become unmanageable and you will lose capability in this morass of features.
In the late 1970s, helmet-mounted displays came of age. The Apache was the first major helicopter production program that integrated a visually coupled system into the original vehicle design. But I think the need for helmet-mounted displays in helicopters is because the helicopters are so highly maneuverable. So a head-mounted and visually coupled system allows rapid response to look all over the situation with a large field of regard, and that's necessary for situation awareness. See where you are in the outside world. I think you're going to see helmet-mounted displays in civil operation in the very near future, starting off with the very basic of an autonomous sensor, such as a night vision goggle, coupled with a helmet-mounted display projection system on the goggle. It won't be long until we'll have low-cost HMDs that provide head-up symbology and possibly imagery. In the future, integrated helmet displays will be essential in both military and civilian applications, and will incorporate new advances in field of view, in color, in resolution, and may allow sensor fusion and synthetic vision for virtual reality.
Helicopters have truly come of age in the commercial market. Every day, civilian helicopters provide safe and efficient transportation for people and valuable cargo. The predominant influence on the evolution of the civilian helicopter cockpit has been military technology transfer.
In the commercial world, they generally followed the military in terms of what they got in the cockpits. And while early on, the commercial cockpits did not have a need for a lot of these things, for instance, helmet-mounted displays or for sophisticated integral lighting for nighttime use, or nav aids, digital maps, or integrated communication systems, or the cockpit management systems that you saw in the military aircraft. As it turns out, these have become almost equally important for the commercial aircraft, because today you have aircraft that are doing offshore operations, operating in all kinds of weather, day and night. So they get caught in IFR, they get caught at nighttime, they get caught in weather. They have to be rigged out in the cockpit to operate in those environments. The people doing emergency medical service, the EMS helicopters, they're on duty 24 hours a day. They go in after the earth, so to speak, where there's wires, where they got to get into places that they can't see. So they have to have the onboard sensors to help them see where they're going. Things like the law enforcement. Again, the law enforcement are getting involved with all kinds of sophisticated sensors and things to help them do reconnaissance of activities that heretofore was not possible or was not thought of. So the civilian helicopter cockpit has followed the military, but it's kind of ironic how much of the military requirements are now becoming civilian requirements also.
Helicopters are one of the most reliable and safest forms of air transportation. Their inherent ability to auto-rotate or maintain a controlled descent to the ground without engine power has saved many lives. The vertical nature of helicopter flight has prompted researchers to develop unique crew protection technologies that further enhance personnel's safety in the case of a mishap.
The most important contribution has been made by crashworthy or stroking seats. The structure of the seat has been designed to provide high retention forces in all directions except the vertical direction in these particular seats. In the vertical direction, energy absorption is provided. The seat bucket in which the occupant sits is suspended from the frame on energy absorbers that have been set to stroke at the humanly tolerable load. In a crash, the decelerative loads build up to the humanly tolerable limit, and when they reach that limit, the energy absorbers begin to stroke and the seat moves towards the aircraft floor. This, of course, limits the load on the occupant's spine, reduces the probability of injury, and minimizes the possibility of paraplegia. I think that the next giant step forward in cockpit safety will be provided by inflatable restraint systems. There are a couple of programs being conducted right now to develop the technology of inflatable restraints for that application. There's a system called IBARS, which stands for Inflatable Body and Head Restraint System, and that's being developed under Army contract for use in the Army's and Navy's Cobra helicopters. And then we're just finishing a program to develop technology for a multiple airbag system that is more similar to the type that you have in your car. These systems will provide a distinct reduction in the number and frequency of injuries sustained by the upper body, striking things like sighting units and the cyclic control sticks during crashes.
In the past 50 years, nothing has changed the complexion of cockpit development like the computer. From computer-aided design to onboard pilot decision aiding, computers are impacting every aspect of how we design, produce, and operate helicopters.
Much of the technology employed in today's cockpits is the direct result of computer-aided design, analysis, and testing. Cockpit designers and human factors engineers use computers for everything from laying out the basic geometry to assessing the location of lights and reflections in cockpits, even to predicting the workload of the pilots who will eventually fly the aircraft. Computers are used to rapidly prototype cockpit displays in order to evaluate information presentation and control. Systems like the Army-NASA Man-Machine Integration Design and Analysis System, or MIDAS, employ digital simulation to allow engineers to design and analyze alternative cockpit concepts and procedures on a single computer workstation. I thoroughly believe that advances in computer graphics technology like virtual reality will soon allow designers to climb into a virtual cockpit, evaluate its layout, and fly a mission right from their desktop.
The challenges of creating a single pilot cockpit really stem from what are the mission requirements that the helicopters going to meet. Can the mission requirements be met with mission equipment package that a single pilot can operate? We've had single pilot cockpits from the very first days of helicopters. The first helicopters were single pilot. Then we talk about more advanced mission requirements, advanced technologies of software-driven, menu-driven glass cockpits, cockpit automation options, and automatic flight control modes. Makes it possible to have single pilot cockpits a lot more complex missions. Moreover, I think our advancements in our front-end analysis techniques, our operations research, through workflow prediction methodologies, computer-aided design, rapid prototyping, early use of simulation makes it feasible to find out real early in helicopter development whether a single pilot or more than a pilot is necessary in your new helicopter. Looking back at the results of an advanced road technology innovation program or the ARTI program, it was a very important, that along with the risk reduction that followed that program, they were very important and vital precursors to the current Comanche program. The primary objective of the ARTI program was to evaluate whether a single crew member could perform the complex and diverse missions that the Army envisioned for the light helicopter LHX, now going to call the RE-66 Comanche helicopter. Now, despite the fact that they decided to train with two crew members rather than one crew member, ARTI really felt a very vital pre-development need
to find out what advanced technology, what mission equipment package items, and what other aircraft features were necessary to meet the RA-66 mission requirements.
Cognitive decision aiding, or attempting to use high-speed digital programs to assist in accomplishing the more complex of the crew station combat activities, has not yet fulfilled its promise. Its aim today is seen not in reducing crew station workload, because crew's workload in advanced helicopters is not excessive, but rather in improving the overall effectiveness of future system combat operations. And one of the major advantages that CDA might offer for future combat operations is to overcome a tendency on the part of human beings to be conservative in their predictions of the future. Computers are not so constrained. Consequently, computers can predict future events with greater certainty than human beings can. If that capability could be properly blended into cockpit operations, information on enemy tactics could be predicted by the CDA system and thereby assist in gaining combat advantage. I see the possibility that CDA might become, in its ultimate, a second crew member. It is possible that CDA will, by acting as a knowledgeable crew member, support more rapid development of tactics, more rapid response to changing enemy tactics, and improve system effectiveness thereby.
Throughout 50 years of helicopter development and operation, the pilot has remained the central element that determines the success of a mission. It is the pilot who makes the delicate flight control inputs to maintain a hover over valuable cargo or choose to tempt fate and make a daring rescue. It is the pilot who has to make the decision to launch a weapon in battle. Cockpit designers have labored to provide the pilot with the information and control necessary to get maximum performance from the machine. In the short span of a lifetime, we have seen the helicopter evolve from a spindly, experimental flying machine into a safe and sophisticated mode of transportation, serving both military and civilian needs. And what are the challenges in cockpit development for the next 50 years?
I don't know as I would call it a challenge, but a desirability would be not to design for the population stereotype, not to design so that everybody has to fit in with everything that the designer makes, but to design for the individual. The computer has allowed us now, if we knew what to do, to make the instruments so flexible that each person might have their own set of instruments. And the way that you would tell the helicopter what your instruments were, you might have a little card that looked like your Visa card or something. Punch it into the instrument panel when you got in. It would adjust your seat to what your requirements were. It would adjust your instruments to the ones that you had been used to using. And therefore, the problem that we have where so many accidents are caused by having to change from what you had originally learned to something new when you get into a stress environment. These things would be negated. You'd have your own cockpit that you'd always had. This I see as something that is realistic in the future and would be desirable.
In my opinion, the three most significant issues are operator acceptance, and operator acceptance. The helicopter community is the most conservative community in aviation. We know what we're used to, and we know what we like. In addition, we have a very low self-esteem. We want what the jet pilots have or what the fixed-wing pilots have just because they have it, not necessarily because it's the right thing for us. We must come to realize that our cockpits are going to be different. Our machines are different. Our cockpits are going to be different. And we need to have in our cockpits what we need to see, and we need to be able to present it in a usable fashion.
Yeah, I think this integrated display is going to be the biggest challenge. It's not unlike the computer-human interface that goes on in the workplace today. The development of software and the user-friendly software as well as interactive control devices and user-friendly interfaces are going to be vital to everything. The current integrated displays, I would venture to say most lay people would be terrified if they looked at a cockpit display and were asked to interpret it readily. So this will, even with professionals, there'll be a continuing challenge for the cockpit integration community to make it simple, straightforward, and interpretable by the crew, or readily interpretable.
Today's standardized instrument panel design or instrument design, I tend to go up. We need to standardize based on mission requirements and glass cockpits and their software-driven menus enable us to be flexible for new mission requirements, and we need to tailor our design specific to those mission requirements. So I think the easy plug-in of a standardized design is behind this, and we trace the future.
I would say the biggest challenge is to eliminate the constant monitoring of power plant attitude controls and to give him the necessary information when he needs it. Just like learning to fly a helicopter or fly an aircraft. One of the earlier problems we had was we required the pilot to learn systems and operation of systems which were relatively unimportant, which he had no control over. The important thing for a pilot to know is when something goes wrong and to know what to do about it, if he can do something about it.
I think to some extent you're going to see helmet-mounted displays in civil operation in the near future, starting off with an autonomous system such as a night vision goggle on a helmet with some sort of projected helmet-mounted display. But I think in the future there are going to have to be low-cost applications because the situation awareness is a very important factor in helicopter operation.
I think the biggest challenge facing crew station designers of the future is the fact that we are now in the information age. We are flooded with more information than we have the capability to manage or react to. And it will be the designer's challenge to find unique ways of integrating and implementing the processing and display of information so that the human being can manage it.